Today, I'm going to go over some of the main topics that I usually go over during the 1 month old well child check. At this age, typically infants are feeding approximately 7 to 8 times per day, although each infant is going to be a little bit different regarding their personality and how often they want to feed and how quickly their stomach size gets bigger compared to when they're a newborn. So, another way to put it would be for this age, feed your infant at least 7 times per 24 hours. And then within that, at least 7 times per 24 hours, you have some flexibility. So if your infant is continuing to feed and grow well, then again, since they usually, as they get older, can feed more at one time, it's safe for most infants for you to let them sleep longer at night if they're continuing to feed relatively frequently during the day. So what I usually tell parents is that if your infant lets you, and if they're not letting you now, then they eventually will sleep up to approximately 5 hours at a time, then it would be safe to let them do that so that you also can get some more rest, which is important. And then as the infant approaches 2 months old, then I say that you could extend that one time sleep as long as he or she continues to feed frequently during the day. You could extend that nighttime sleep to approximately 1 6 hour stretch. When an infant is first born, then usually they're not as efficient or vigorous with breastfeeding if you are breastfeeding. So we say to give your infant initially during the first week enough time at the breast, approximately 15 to 20 minutes each breast per feed. For some infants, that longer duration of feeding might still be necessary, but if your infant is becoming more efficient, more vigorous with the feeding, and you feel like they seem satiated and full after a shorter amount of time, let's say hypothetically around 10 minutes each breast, then that's okay and not necessarily abnormal. So you don't have to stay to that standard of roughly 15 to 20 minutes each breast of breastfeeding as your infant gets older, and there is some flexibility that you can cater that duration depending on what your infant seems to need. As your child gets older, if you run into a situation where you feel like my breast milk production isn't keeping up with his or her growth needs, or a breastfeeding mother feels like she needs to get more rest and sleep, which is again very reasonable and normal, then it's allowable to supplement some of the breastfeeding with bottle feeding. For example, some other caretaker, if available, could bottle feed for one or two or some of the night feeding sessions with formula or express breast milk. Each family will choose on their own whether they feel comfortable with introducing some formula, or if you're already giving mostly formula, then that is a safe alternative if you've chosen to do that for different reasons. Another way to do optional supplemental bottle feeding would be you breastfeed for a certain duration, and then if it seems like your infant isn't satiated, then you're allowed to offer the bottle, either breast milk or formula, to top off your child if it seems like they're still hungry. So this optional bottle supplementation would only be if you had concerns that the breast milk production isn't sustaining his or her needs, but with just normal, regular, continued, relatively frequent feeding, that commonly is not an issue or a problem. I usually have mentioned to parents to start some tummy time after approximately 2 weeks old if the umbilical cord has fallen off by then. And so I usually remind them at this checkup to do some tummy time here and there. There isn't a set number of days that you have to do it, but approximately anywhere from 2 to 4 times per day. And you can continue to do however many minutes your child tolerates and don't need to feel pressured to do a lot. But I do say to increase the tummy time to cumulative 15 to 30 minutes per day by 2 months old, to continue to slowly increase the tummy time for optimizing motor development, neck muscle flexibility, and helping to prevent any type of cosmetic skull flattening type of issues. A 1 month old developmentally is not expected to do a lot of different advanced things yet. But what we look for at 1 month old is focusing a little bit more with his or her eyes if some high contrast colored thing is in front of his or her face, or let's say you're looking at your newborn and just focusing more on those types of things, although they aren't expected to follow a lot with their eyes yet or be able to see clearly. And another milestone for a 1 month old is while you're doing tummy time to be able to lift their chest more than before when they were first born. Finally, I usually give a heads up about recommendations for sleep training. The age at which an infant has the mental capacity to learn sleep training habits is approximately 6 weeks old and up. So at 1 month old, it's a little bit too early to expect a child to learn sleep training habits, or it's too early that you're going to spoil them with any habits. But you can start to sleep train a child anytime 6 weeks old and up. So sometime after that age, we recommend certain things to increase the likelihood that they'll sleep longer and longer through the night without needing to feed. So an expectation might be around 6 hours at 2 months old. About half of infants can sleep 6 to 8 hours through the night without needing to feed, with sleep training usually at 4 months old, and approximately 8 to 10 hours through the night by 8 months old. And of course, there are infants who are doing less than that or able to do more than that, depending on different factors, but that is what some of the data shows. So the main recommendations for sleep training are the following. So one of the most important concepts is after that age, that you do a sleep routine, and you can pick whatever you'd like, something along the lines of giving a bath or a massage, or reading them a story, or any combination of the above. And if there's feeding prior to bedtime, then we recommend doing that before the sleep routine, at least 20 minutes before you put them down to sleep. And so the order would be potential feeding, a bedtime routine, and then while they're awake, you put your infant in the crib. And even though it takes a certain amount of crying or fussing, they fall asleep on their own, so that if they wake up very shortly later, an hour, hour and a half later, when you're hoping it'll be longer, they've had practice going to sleep on their own instead of crying and relying on you to come rock them to sleep or feed them until they fall asleep. As that happens, again, if you're hoping and expecting that they'll sleep at 2 months old approximately at least 5 to 6 hours before needing to feed, and your infant wakes up 2 hours later, it's not emotionally harmful for them for you to let them cry. Now, there are multiple different types of sleep training, and so it is safe to choose the cry it out method, where you and a partner decides we are going to stay committed to the cry it out method, and no matter how long it takes, we're not going to intervene and let our child fall asleep on his or her own. So there isn't a maximum amount of time you're allowed to do that, where if you go past that, then there's going to be dangers to their vocal cords or emotional development or any other complications like that. But you don't have to do the cry it out method. There are good sleep training books out there. One that I think is very good is one called Precious Little Sleep, which I'll include the reference in the notes below. And another method that you could do is something called the extinction method, which is something along the lines of you rub your child's belly until they fall asleep for a couple days. The next 2 days, you rock their crib a little bit until they fall asleep. The next 2 days, you sit close to the crib, and then the next 2 days farther away, the next day at the door, until you're not doing any more interventions. So they need less and less gradual interventions to fall asleep. And while you're doing the sleep training, it in general will be difficult because of a lot of crying involved, but it's very much worth it. The payoff and how well your child is able to sleep after approximately 3 to 10 days of sleep training, where the sleep training has worked and the whole family is getting better sleep. So if your child wakes up in the middle of the night sooner than expected, then you could just let them cry it out. And if you want to check on them after a certain number of minutes, because they're not going back to sleep on their own, then we say check on them with minimal stimulation, meaning don't turn on the lights, don't pick them up, don't feed them. Gentler things like rubbing their belly or back or wherever it might be, and then leaving them alone again to soothe themselves to sleep or cry themselves to sleep by sucking on their hand or whatever they need to do, so that your child gets trained during this stretch of night. Just because they cry, they're not getting these enjoyable activities from mom and dad. They just have to go to sleep on their own. Again, not something that you have to do right at 6 weeks old, but allowed to do it as early as 6 weeks old. And in general, the earlier you do the sleep training, there are a lot of benefits to that, because it's a shorter time that your child may get used to sleep associations, relying on other parent interventions to go to sleep. And as a reminder, continue the once a day vitamin D supplements, which we say pretty much to give the whole first year. Those are the main topics I usually like to go over at the 1-month-old checkup. And the next video will be about the usual topics we go over at the 2-month-old checkup. Bye until then.